Inspector Thompson's notebook contained a detailed record of Marcus's violations as she methodically explained each charge. Sir, you've been cited for violating royal security protocols, ignoring police directives, trespassing in a restricted area, and endangering public safety. Each of these carries significant penalties under British law. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. Penalties? What kind of penalties? I'm supposed to fly home in 3 days. That timeline may need to change, depending on how you choose to handle this situation. Inspector Thompson replied matter-of-factly. You'll need to appear before a magistrate, and there's also the matter of a formal complaint that will need to be filed with your embassy. The word embassy hit Marcus like a physical blow. His mind raced through the implications of having an international incident on his record. His business dealings often required security clearances and background checks. A formal diplomatic complaint could affect everything from his company's government contracts to his ability to travel internationally in the future. Look, can't we just work this out somehow? Marcus asked, his voice taking on a pleading tone that was completely different from his earlier arrogance. I'll pay a fine, make a donation to charity, whatever you think is appropriate. This doesn't need to become a big deal. Sergeant Collins, who had been observing the conversation while maintaining security, stepped forward. Sir, this became a big deal. The moment you ignored multiple warnings and entered a secure area where armed guards are protecting national assets. There's no negotiating your way out of the consequences. The crowd around them had thinned somewhat as the immediate drama subsided, but many tourists remained, drawn by the ongoing spectacle of an entitled visitor facing real accountability. Some were taking photos of Marcus's disheveled appearance and posting them on social media with comments about respecting other countries' traditions. Wellington had returned to his full ceremonial stillness, but Trooper Harrison remained alert to any signs that Marcus might attempt another approach. The horse's earlier display had been a perfectly measured response to a perceived threat, demonstrating both his training and his natural protective instincts. I want to call my lawyer, Marcus announced, as if this would somehow change his situation. And I want to contact the American embassy immediately. You'll have those opportunities, Inspector Thompson assured him, right after we complete the formal arrest process and transport you to the station for booking. The word arrest seemed to echo in Marcus's mind. In all his years of aggressive business dealings and boundary-pushing behavior, he had never actually been arrested. The closest he had come was a few heated exchanges with building inspectors and one memorable argument with a county commissioner, but those had always been resolved through connections and negotiations. Dr. Chun, the physician who had checked on Marcus earlier, approached Inspector Thompson with her business card. If you need a witness statement about his condition immediately after the incident, I'm happy to provide one. He appeared more shocked than physically injured. Thank you. That's very helpful, Inspector Thompson replied, making a note in her book. Did you observe the entire sequence of events? Yes, from the moment he crossed the barrier until he was on the ground. The horse's reaction was clearly defensive, not aggressive. If anything, the animal showed remarkable restraint given the perceived threat. Marcus overheard this conversation and felt another wave of disbelief. Even a random tourist was supporting the horse over him. Threat? I was just trying to take a photo. How is that a threat? The elderly veteran with service medals, who had been watching the proceedings with growing satisfaction, stepped closer. Son, I served with cavalry units during my military career. That horse responded exactly as he was trained to do. You approached an armed guard in a threatening manner, and the horse protected his rider. You're lucky it wasn't worse. Threatening manner? Marcus's voice rose with indignation. I was holding a phone, not a weapon. From the horse's perspective, you were an unknown individual who had violated security perimeters and approached rapidly with an object in your hand, the veteran explained patiently. Wellington did exactly what centuries of breeding and training prepared him to do. Inspector Thompson looked up from her notes. Mr. Kellerman, you need to understand that these horses are considered part of the royal security apparatus. Interfering with them is treated as seriously as interfering with any other security measure. The reality of his situation was finally beginning to penetrate Marcus's defenses. His wife Sarah was going to be furious when she found out. His business partners would be shocked and possibly concerned about the negative publicity. His friends at the country club would never let him live down being arrested for harassing a horse. What exactly happens next? Marcus asked, his voice much quieter than it had been all morning. You'll be transported to the station, formally charged, and given the opportunity to contact legal representation, Inspector Thompson explained. Depending on how you plead, and whether you show appropriate remorse for your actions, the magistrate may consider reduced penalties. Remorse? Marcus looked genuinely confused. Remorse for what exactly? This question prompted another collective murmur from the remaining crowd. Even after everything that had happened, Marcus still didn't seem to understand that he had done anything wrong. Sergeant Collins exchanged a look with Inspector Thompson. They had both dealt with difficult tourists before, but Marcus's complete lack of awareness about his behavior was remarkable even by their standards. Sir, you violated security protocols designed to protect both the guards and the public, Sergeant Collins said slowly, as if explaining to a child. You ignored direct orders from police officers. You endangered yourself and others by approaching a large, trained animal in an inappropriate manner. Most importantly, you showed complete disrespect for a centuries-old tradition that represents the dignity and security of the monarchy. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but then noticed the expressions on the faces around him. For the first time all morning, he began to wonder if maybe, possibly, he might actually be in the wrong. The young mother with her 2 children had been using the incident as a teaching moment. You see, she was explaining to them quietly. This is why we follow rules and listen to police officers. Rules exist to keep everyone safe. Her children nodded solemnly, understanding the lesson in a way that Marcus was only beginning to grasp. A police van arrived to transport Marcus to the station. As the officers prepared him for transport, he caught sight of his reflection in the van's window. His expensive suit was torn and dirty, his hair was disheveled, and his expression showed a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. My wife is going to kill me, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. She's probably going to be more disappointed than angry, suggested Dr. Chen gently. This kind of behavior reflects on both of you as travelers. As Marcus was helped into the police van, he looked back at Wellington one final time. The magnificent horse stood in perfect ceremonial position, dignified and alert, a living symbol of tradition and duty. For just a moment, Marcus began to understand what he had failed to appreciate earlier. The incident would be reported in newspapers around the world within hours. Videos of Marcus's encounter with Wellington would go viral on social media, becoming a cautionary tale about respect for other cultures and traditions. Travel bloggers would use his story as an example of how not to behave as a tourist. Back home in Dallas, Marcus's business associates would read about his arrest with a mixture of embarrassment and concern. His wife Sarah would have to deal with friends and neighbors asking awkward questions. His reputation, carefully built over years of business success, would be forever linked to the day he learned that some boundaries should never be crossed. Wellington continued his ceremonial duty, unaware that he had become an international symbol of dignity and proper response to inappropriate behavior. Trooper Harrison gave his mount another subtle pat of approval, proud of how professionally Wellington had handled a difficult situation. The morning ceremony continued around them, but for everyone present, the lesson was clear. Respect for tradition, protocol, and authority isn't negotiable, regardless of your nationality, wealth, or personal sense of entitlement. Marcus Kellerman had learned this lesson the hard way, in front of an international audience that would remember his story for years to come. Marcus ducked under the rope barrier with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. The moment his foot crossed into the restricted area, multiple things happened simultaneously. Wellington's head shot up, his ears pinned back, and Trooper Harrison's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his reins. The crowd collectively held its breath as Marcus approached the massive horse with his phone extended. "Sir, step back immediately," shouted Sergeant Collins, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police who specialized in royal protection duties. His voice carried the authority of someone who had dealt with security threats at the highest levels. But Marcus barely acknowledged the command. "Relax, I just want one quick photo," Marcus called back, his attention focused entirely on his phone screen as he tried to frame the perfect shot. "I'll be done in a second." What Marcus didn't understand was that Wellington wasn't just any horse. This magnificent animal had been specifically selected and trained for guard duty based on his intelligence, temperament, and protective instincts. The horse's breeding traced back to war horses that had carried cavalry into battle, and those instincts remained very much alive beneath his ceremonial role. Marcus stepped closer, now within arm's reach of Wellington's powerful flank. The horse's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of Marcus's cologne mixed with nervous sweat. Wellington's training told him to remain still, but his deeper instincts recognized a potential threat approaching his rider and himself. "This is your final warning," Sergeant Collins called out as he began moving toward the barrier. Behind him, 2 additional officers were already in motion, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond a simple tourist misunderstanding into a potential security incident. Marcus raised his phone higher, trying to get both himself and the guard in the frame. "Come on, this is ridiculous," he muttered, apparently believing that his frustration would somehow make the situation less serious. "It's just a horse." That phrase would later be repeated in news reports around the world. But at the moment Marcus spoke it, Wellington's reaction was swift and decisive. The horse's head swung around with lightning speed, his massive teeth baring as he lunged toward Marcus's outstretched arm. The crowd screamed as Marcus stumbled backward, his phone flying through the air and landing with a sharp crack on the cobblestones. Wellington's teeth had missed Marcus's arm by mere inches, but the message was unmistakably clear. The horse reared slightly, his powerful hooves dancing dangerously close to where Marcus had been standing. Trooper Harrison demonstrated the skill that years of training had developed, bringing Wellington under control with subtle movements that the crowd couldn't even see. His expression never changed, but his expertise in handling both his mount and the security situation was evident to anyone who understood horsemanship. Marcus found himself on the ground, his expensive suit torn and dirty from his hasty retreat. His face had gone pale with shock as the reality of what had nearly happened began to sink in. The horse that he had dismissed as merely decorative had just demonstrated why centuries of tradition demanded respect and distance. "Are you injured, sir?" asked Dr. Sarah Chun, a tourist from Hong Kong who happened to be a practicing physician. She approached cautiously, keeping a respectful distance from Wellington while checking on Marcus's condition. I don't think so," Marcus stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. His hands were shaking as he tried to brush dirt from his jacket, and he couldn't stop staring at Wellington, who had returned to his position but remained alert and ready to respond to any further threats. Sergeant Collins reached Marcus's position within seconds, his professional training evident in how he simultaneously assessed the tourist's condition, secured the area, and coordinated with his colleagues. "Sir, you need to come with me immediately," he said in a tone that brooked no argument. The crowd had pulled back to give everyone space, but dozens of phones were now recording the aftermath of Marcus's encounter with Wellington. Several tourists had captured the entire sequence, from Marcus crossing the barrier to his undignified scramble away from the horse's warning display. "I want to file a complaint," Marcus said, his voice shaky but still carrying traces of his earlier arrogance. "That horse attacked me. Someone needs to control that animal." A collective gasp rose from the crowd at Marcus's words. The elderly veteran with service medals stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. That horse was doing his duty, protecting his rider and maintaining security. You ignored multiple warnings and entered a restricted area. Sergeant Collins raised his hand to quiet the growing murmur of agreement from the crowd. "Sir, you violated clearly marked security perimeters and ignored direct orders from police officers. You're fortunate that Trooper Harrison maintained control of his mount, or this situation could have been much more serious." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him, expecting to see sympathy or support for his position. Instead, he saw expressions ranging from disapproval to outright anger. The young mother with 2 children was explaining in hushed tones why the man had been wrong to approach the horse. Her children nodded solemnly, understanding instinctively what Marcus had failed to grasp. "I'm an American citizen," Marcus said, as if this fact would somehow change the situation. I have rights here. Yes, sir. And one of those rights is the right to face legal consequences for your actions, replied Inspector Margaret Thompson, who had just arrived on the scene. She was the senior officer responsible for security at ceremonial events, and her expression made it clear that she had seen this type of entitled behavior before. Marcus's broken phone lay forgotten on the cobblestones as he tried to process what was happening. In his mind, he was the victim of an overly aggressive horse and unreasonable security measures. The possibility that he might actually be held accountable for his actions was something he hadn't considered. Meanwhile, Wellington had returned to his ceremonial position, but his ears remained alert and his eyes occasionally flicked toward Marcus's location. Trooper Harrison gave the horse a subtle pat, a gesture of approval for his protective instincts while maintaining the stoic demeanor required of the guard. "This is insane," Marcus protested as Inspector Thompson approached with an official-looking notebook. "I was just trying to take a photograph. Everyone does it. This is completely blown out of proportion." "Sir, not everyone ignores police warnings and enters restricted security areas," Inspector Thompson replied calmly. "And certainly not everyone approaches a trained military horse while disregarding multiple safety protocols." The crowd continued to watch as the situation unfolded. Many tourists were from countries where royal traditions and military ceremonies were treated with deep respect, and they were genuinely shocked by Marcus's behavior and attitude. Some began sharing their own stories of visiting similar ceremonies in their home countries, emphasizing the universal nature of showing respect for traditions and security requirements. A news reporter who happened to be covering the ceremony for a local television station had captured much of the incident on camera. She was already mentally crafting her story about the American tourist who had learned the hard way why the Queen's Guard protocols existed for everyone's safety. Marcus's situation was rapidly moving beyond a simple tourist incident into something that would have legal and diplomatic implications. His earlier confidence had been replaced by a growing awareness that his actions might have consequences he hadn't anticipated. The ceremonial activities around them continued with professional precision. The other guards and horses maintained their positions and duties despite the disruption, demonstrating the discipline and training that made them effective in their roles. The incident with Marcus had become a teachable moment for everyone present about the serious nature of royal protocol. Inspector Thompson began explaining to Marcus exactly which laws he had violated and what would happen next. Her calm, professional demeanor contrasted sharply with Marcus's growing agitation as he realized that his vacation was about to take a very different turn than he had planned. Wellington stood perfectly still once again, but everyone present now understood that beneath his ceremonial role lay the instincts and training of a true guardian. The horse's reaction had been proportionate, professional, and precisely what his training had prepared him for when faced with a potential security threat. The morning sun continued to shine down on Horse Guards Parade, but for Marcus Kellerman, the day had become a harsh lesson in respect, consequences, and the serious nature of traditions that had protected the monarchy for centuries. His entitled approach to travel and rules had finally met a situation where his usual tactics would not work. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Horse Guards Parade as tourists began gathering for the daily ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Kellerman, a 38-year-old businessman from Dallas, Texas, who had arrived in London 3 days earlier for what he called the vacation of a lifetime. Marcus wore expensive designer clothes, carried the latest smartphone, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from always getting his way back home. Marcus had built his wealth through aggressive real estate deals and wasn't used to being told no. His wife Sarah had warned him before the trip to respect British customs and traditions, but Marcus brushed off her concerns. He was an American citizen, he reasoned, and that should count for something everywhere in the world. The Queen's lifeguard ceremony was about to begin, and the magnificent horses stood perfectly still with their riders in full ceremonial dress. The black horse nearest to the crowd was particularly striking, a 17-hand gelding named Wellington who had served with distinction for 6 years. His rider, Trooper James Harrison, sat ramrod straight in his ornate uniform, sword at his side, trained to remain motionless regardless of distractions. Marcus pushed through the gathering crowd, ignoring the polite protests of other tourists who had been waiting patiently for better viewing positions. He pulled out his phone and began taking photos, but the standard tourist shots weren't enough for him. Marcus wanted something spectacular, something that would impress his business associates back in Dallas. "Excuse me, sir. Please maintain a respectful distance from the horse," called out a nearby police officer, noticing Marcus edging closer to Wellington. Marcus barely glanced at the officer. In his mind, he was simply trying to get the perfect photograph. The rules that applied to other tourists surely didn't apply to someone of his status and importance. He had paid good money for this trip, stayed in a 5-star hotel, and expected to get his money's worth. The crowd around them was typical for a Tuesday morning in July. There were families with children, elderly couples on guided tours, and groups of international students. Most maintained the respectful distance that had been clearly marked by rope barriers and signs in multiple languages. But Marcus saw these boundaries as mere suggestions rather than requirements. Wellington, despite his training, began to show signs of unease as Marcus continued to move closer. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, and his nostrils flared slightly. Trooper Harrison, maintaining his stoic expression, applied gentle pressure with his legs to keep Wellington steady, but the horse's instincts were telling him that something wasn't right. Marcus decided that what he really needed was a selfie with the horse and guard in the background. This would be the perfect photo to post on his social media accounts and show off to his friends at the country club. He stretched his arm out, holding his phone at various angles, but couldn't get the shot he wanted from behind the barriers. "The lighting's all wrong from back here," Marcus muttered to himself, completely ignoring the increasing number of disapproving looks from fellow tourists. A tour guide with a group of Japanese visitors tried to gently redirect Marcus's attention to the historical significance of the ceremony they were witnessing. She explained in careful English how the Queen's lifeguard had protected the monarch for centuries, and how the horses and riders underwent years of specialized training. Marcus wasn't interested in history lessons. He interrupted the tour guide mid-sentence, asking if she knew when the real action would start. The tour guide politely explained that the ceremony itself was the attraction, but Marcus rolled his eyes and turned his attention back to his phone. The other tourists began whispering among themselves. A British couple who had traveled from Manchester specifically to show their visiting relatives this ceremony expressed quiet outrage at Marcus's behavior. An elderly veteran wearing his service medals shook his head in disgust, remembering his own time serving alongside the household cavalry. Sarah, Marcus's wife, wasn't present for this particular outing. She had chosen to visit the British Museum instead, partly because she was genuinely interested in the exhibits, but also because she had grown tired of her husband's increasingly embarrassing behavior during their vacation. The previous day at the Tower of London, Marcus had argued with a yeoman warder about photography restrictions and demanded to speak to someone in charge. Marcus's frustration with the barriers grew stronger as he watched other tourists taking what he considered inferior photos. In his mind, he deserved better access than these ordinary people. He had worked hard for his success and believed that success should come with privileges, even in foreign countries. The security personnel present included both uniformed police officers and plainclothes protection officers who were trained to identify potential threats while allowing tourists to enjoy the ceremony. They had dealt with difficult visitors before, but something about Marcus's attitude and body language put them on higher alert. Wellington continued to sense the tension building around him. Despite his extensive training, the horse's natural instincts couldn't be completely suppressed. His rider, Trooper Harrison, had been serving with the household cavalry for 8 years and had developed an almost telepathic connection with his mount. He could feel Wellington's growing unease, but maintained his ceremonial position. Marcus checked his expensive watch and sighed dramatically. He had other tourist attractions on his schedule and didn't want to waste the entire morning on what he was beginning to see as a static display rather than the dynamic show he had expected. His impatience was becoming more obvious to everyone around him. A young mother with 2 small children tried to explain to them in whispered tones about the importance of being quiet and respectful during the ceremony. Her children, wide-eyed with wonder at the magnificent horses and colorful uniforms, instinctively understood what Marcus seemed incapable of grasping. The morning air was crisp but warming as more tourists arrived. The crowd was becoming denser, which made Marcus even more determined to secure what he saw as his rightful position for photographs. He began to calculate how he might get closer to the horse without attracting too much attention from the security personnel. Marcus's business success had come partly from his willingness to push boundaries and ignore rules that he felt didn't apply to him. This approach had served him well in real estate negotiations and corporate dealings, but he failed to understand that some boundaries existed for reasons beyond mere bureaucracy. The ceremonial preparations continued around them as Marcus grew increasingly agitated with the restrictions on his photography. He had seen other tourists on previous days posting photos that seemed much closer to the guards and horses, though he didn't realize these images had been taken from designated photo opportunities during less formal moments. Wellington's training had prepared him for crowds, noise, and unexpected movements, but the horse's keen senses detected something different about Marcus's energy and intentions. Animals often perceive human emotions and motivations more clearly than humans themselves realize, and Wellington's unease continued to grow. Trooper Harrison maintained his focus on his duties while remaining aware of the developing situation. His training had taught him to assess potential threats while maintaining the dignified bearing required of the Queen's Guard. Years of experience had given him an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble before it fully developed. Marcus made his decision. The barriers were clearly just suggestions, and he was going to get the photograph he wanted. After all, what could really happen? He was just a tourist trying to take a picture. Surely any reasonable person would understand his desire to capture a memorable moment from his expensive vacation. The crowd watched with growing tension as Marcus approached the rope barrier with obvious intent. Some tourists began reaching for their own phones, sensing that they were about to witness something unusual. Others stepped back, recognizing that the situation was about to escalate beyond normal tourist photography. Marcus reached for the rope barrier, his mind focused entirely on the perfect selfie he was about to capture. He remained completely oblivious to the multiple warning signs around him and the growing concern of everyone else present. His sense of entitlement and privilege had blinded him to the reality that some rules existed for very serious reasons. The moment of decision had arrived, and Marcus stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for ignoring boundaries. What happened next would teach him a lesson about respect, tradition, and the serious nature of royal protocol that he would never forget.